One of the questions that my mother told me to ask you, because obviously my mother and my father, they have watched the Dutch news over the last years, especially during the presence of Dutch forces in Afghanistan. And there was a character that was often in the Dutch newscast about Afghanistan, who was extremely despised and hated by Afghans, at least here in the Netherlands.
Okay.
And this guy was basically empowered and became like the local tyrant in Uruzgan thanks to foreign forces. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, Jan Mohammed.
Yes. So, have you actually met Jan Mohammed?
No, but you touch an interesting subject, because this is basically one of those things we should not have mingled with, because we started telling, like, this is a good guy and that is a bad guy. We wanted to implement democracy, and at the same time we appointed governors, which is not very democratic if you ask me. And at the same time, I mean, I've been present when there were talks with certain column warlords, which is a bit too much to call them, but column warlords, maybe better to call them militia leaders. We talked to them, not me, because my rank was too low, but my superiors talked to them, and they simply said, well, we like him, and we don't like him. And then they started talking about the affiliation that they probably had with certain tribes, and they started to discuss the influence that a certain tribe could have over, while they didn't know a thing about it. I mean, if you really want to talk about tribes in Afghanistan, you should at least live there for 5 years among the people, and you maybe, but only maybe, start to understand how that system works. And yet, we walked in, and a month later, we started talking about the influences of certain tribes, and that militia leader was from that tribe, and that militia, so we better supported that militia leader because he was against blah blah blah, which was ridiculous. Because if you want to know such things and want to have an opinion about it, you as I said, you need to have lived there for 5 years minimum to understand the tiniest thing of tribal relations. The other thing that I discovered was that the population in Afghanistan, or in Uruzgan, or in the small area that we did not control, but that we traveled through, those people weren't interested the least in tribal differences. And that's something I write in my book as well, that when I talked about it with people, they were just like, what? It's not a big deal. It is tribal issues are as ingrained as the Pashtunwali are. I mean, we know certain things, but they're not important. We know that he's from that tribe and he's from that tribe, but important? No, it's not important. I mean, we live with it, we understand it, it's part of our lives, but not a big thing. We made a big thing out of it. And we told ourselves that we knew about all these tribal relations. We didn't. We didn't have a clue about them, but still we said, okay, we want to support that tribe. We didn't even know where they lived, but we want to support that tribe by implementing that militia commander because he is sympathetic to blah blah. And it didn't make any sense because we didn't know. And yeah, there was Jan Mohammed, there was Matiula and Obadullah, and there were all kinds of people that we thought were interesting. They were not. They were just local people that tried to make a buck out of our presence there. That was the main thing they wanted, arms and money. And they got it.
And that's quite interesting to hear that from your perspective, because obviously as an Afghan, I always try to learn a lot about Afghanistan because I was an interpreter for Afghan refugees and here in the Netherlands, and I wanted to be able to translate and provide context when someone asks something, to provide context, and you see that certain issues, certain topics are not easily translated, but this is a relatively safe environment where you translate for refugees. But in Afghanistan, what you say about a person, his background, his allegiance to this or that group can actually cost people lives. Would you say that translators and advisors and consultants of foreign forces played a positive or a negative role in the affairs in Uruzgan?
They played a devastating negative role in whatever happened in Uruzgan, because most of our interpreters or advisors did not even speak Pashto, but we didn't bother to check. They just translated, but we had no clue what they translated. They were not schooled at being an interpreter, because it's not something you can do just like that. It's not a matter of knowing 2 languages. You need to be able to stand your ground in a potential war zone, and in a potential war zone, sometimes there is a big boom. That big boom is not necessarily a war act. There could as well be a tire that blows, or what I call it often a pressure cooker in my book that says boom, and then forces suddenly react. It is something an interpreter should be aware of. He should be able to just do his job in a conflict zone. And those interpreters that we had were not trained to do that. They were just picked based on the 2 languages we thought they spoke. And as a matter of fact, I personally discovered that the interpreters we had did not speak Pashto at all, because I spoke a little bit of Pashto, and I realized at a certain moment that they absolutely were unable to translate what they had to translate. So I told my superiors. They were extremely angry with me, because they thought I had no grounds for my accusations, and I developed a test to be able to test our interpreters, and the results of that test were, bad, because they didn't speak a word Pashto, and they barely spoke any English, and all their translations were based on self-interest, which is logical, because in their position I would have done the same. But we should have realized that they wanted to remain on their base, which is logical, because they were safe, the money was the same, they didn't want to leave, they didn't want to get into the bad country. So they did. A practical thing that happened is that we intercepted a lot of ICOM chatter, as we called it. I mean, in that period of time, the Afghan people, the local population, communicated by means of walkie-talkies. And there was nothing more fun for the local population than to tell through these walkie-talkies that they were going to attack us, or that they had all kinds of things ready to lay an ambush or something, which was complete fun. But the translations of those semi-threats were made by people that could not properly translate, but that apart, they wished to return to their base, so they exaggerated whatever they heard. Oh, there's a big attack coming, and there's 50 Taliban, and the word Taliban wasn't even mentioned in those discussions, but as soon as an interpreter, translated it like that, it was taken seriously, and all things happened based on that kind of translations that should not have been there. I mean, those translations were ridiculous, and they were made by people that didn't even speak Pashto, and so on and so on, and that created a horrible situation. And the whole our operations in Uruzgan would have been completely different had we had proper interpreters, people that spoke both languages, Pashto and English, and that had no own agenda, people that had been vetted based on why do you want to be an interpreter. They should have at least have like a 6 months training in certain things. They should have been real interpreters, and they weren't. They were just people that were picked from the streets of Kabul or Kandahar. Yeah, I speak 2 languages. I'm teacher. I'm teacher from the Kabul. Okay, okay, wonderful. Come with us. And I opposed to that idea. I developed a test. I could prove that our interpreters were not really interpreters. The mission was called to a halt. I was sent to Kandahar, and I was ordered to select interpreters, which I did. But still, the people I selected were not true interpreters. They were people that could really speak Pashto. I mean, I made sure that they could, and they spoke English well enough to communicate with us. Then there's another thing. There were lots of Dutch soldiers that didn't speak English that well, so there was another obstacle. but at least I could guarantee that the people we worked with spoke 2 languages reasonably well. But that didn't make them Terps. That didn't make them interpreters. That made them only people that spoke 2 languages, which is not enough to be an interpreter in a conflict zone. So they made their own stories, they had their own agenda, they sometimes didn't really get to the point, and they translated just what they thought was convenient, and that created all kinds of situations that should not have been created. And the Dutch army should have been aware of that problem way ahead, and they should have started to select their interpreters like a year beforehand, because they knew that it was somehow coming to a mission in Afghanistan, and they should have been aware of the problem with interpreters, and they didn't do anything. They just picked some people from the streets and they started a mission with those people, which is a crime in my opinion.